The sun rose over Monaco at 6:47 that morning. It was the kind of morning that makes you believe the world is fundamentally beautiful. Pale gold light spilling across the Mediterranean, the harbour still and glassy, the white buildings of Monte Carlo catching the first warmth of September. Yachts rocked gently in their moorings. The casino hadn't opened yet. The streets were quiet. Inside the Palace of Monaco, the morning routine had already begun. Servants moved through the corridors with practiced silence. Breakfast trays were being prepared in the kitchen. The gardeners were already in the grounds, trimming the hedges that Princess Grace had personally chosen for the courtyard 15 years ago. Everything was exactly as it always was. Except that it wasn't. Grace Patricia Kelly, Princess Grace of Monaco, former Hollywood actress, Oscar winner, the woman who had been called the most beautiful person in the world, woke at 7 o'clock with a heaviness in her chest that she couldn't name. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. She had not slept well. She hadn't slept well in weeks. She was 52 years old. She had lived in this palace for 26 years. She had given her life to this country, to this family, to this role, and yet some mornings she woke up feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She rose, bathed, applied her makeup with the careful precision of a woman who had spent decades being looked at. She chose a simple dress. Nothing elaborate. They were driving to Rock Agel, the family's farm in the hills above Monaco, and then returning to the city. A practical day. But first, she had to talk to Stephanie. Her youngest daughter, 18 years old, fierce, impulsive, gloriously alive in a way that sometimes made Grace's heart ache, had announced that she was not coming back to Monaco. She wanted to stay in Paris. She wanted to pursue a music career. She wanted, above all else, to be free. Grace understood the feeling better than anyone. That was precisely what made it so difficult to accept. She knocked on Stephanie's door at 8:30. The conversation that followed was tense, as it always was between them. Two people who loved each other too much and understood each other too well, which is sometimes the most painful combination possible. Stephanie was stubborn. Grace was immovable. Neither gave ground. By 9:15, they were getting into the car. Grace had dismissed her driver that morning. She would drive herself. She knew the road, had driven it hundreds of times. The Rover 3500 was a reliable car. The weather was clear. It was a short journey. She helped Stephanie into the passenger seat, walked around to the driver's side, and settled in behind the wheel. She started the engine. None of this seemed significant at the time. None of this seemed like anything other than an ordinary Tuesday morning in September, a mother and daughter driving through the hills of the French Riviera, still arguing about the future, still negotiating the terms of love. But this was the last ordinary moment. Everything that came after would be something else entirely. To understand why Grace Kelly died the way she did, you first have to understand how she lived. She was born on November 12, 1929, in East Falls, Philadelphia, a neighborhood that considered itself a cut above the rest of the city, which was itself a city that considered itself a cut above most of the country. Her father, Jack Kelly, was a self-made millionaire who had won 3 Olympic gold medals in rowing and built a construction empire from nothing. He was charming, domineering, and deeply competitive. He wanted sons. He got Grace. Her mother, Margaret, was a former model and physical education instructor who had married up and intended to stay there. She was organized, controlled, and emotionally distant in the way that women of her generation and class were trained to be. Affection was demonstrated through achievement, not embrace. Grace grew up trying to earn love that should have been given freely. She was not the favored child. Her brother Kel was the golden one, athletic, handsome, destined for the Olympic career their father had mapped out for him. Her sister Peggy was vivacious and popular. Grace was the quiet one, the one with the childhood asthma that kept her inside while the others played, the one who retreated into her imagination and found, in stories and in performance, a world that felt more real than the one she lived in. She acted in local theatre productions. She discovered she was good at it. More than good, she had something that the stage amplifies and the camera loves, a quality that is almost impossible to describe but immediately recognizable: presence. When Grace walked into a room, or onto a stage, or in front of a lens, something happened to the air. At 18, She enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York. Her father thought it was a phase. Her mother thought it was a mistake. Grace thought it was the beginning. She was right. She modeled to pay her rent. Her face appeared on the covers of magazines, advertising cigarettes and suntan lotion and cosmetics, but acting was what she wanted. She auditioned constantly. She got small roles. She worked. She studied. She refused to be discouraged, even when the early notices described her as stiff, cold, too controlled for the stage. They weren't wrong, exactly. But they were misreading the evidence. Grace Kelly wasn't cold. She was armored. There is a difference that only becomes apparent when someone manages to get through, and on screen, under the right conditions, with the right director, what looked like coldness became something else entirely. A smoldering restraint that was more erotic, more compelling, more dangerous than open passion. The armor was the point. The armor was the art. Alfred Hitchcock understood this immediately. He cast her in Dial M for Murder in 1954, and then watched what happened when the camera found her. He understood, intuitively, what Grace was doing with that surface of composure. She was creating tension. Every scene she was in became about the question of when that composure would crack, and what would come out if it did. The audience leaned forward. They couldn't look away. He cast her again in Rear Window that same year, opposite Jimmy Stewart. And then again in To Catch a Thief in 1955, opposite Cary Grant, on the French Riviera. A film that would turn out to be remarkably prophetic. In 1955, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress for The Country Girl. She was 25 years old. She was, by any measure, at the absolute peak of her powers and her career. The role she could have played, the films she could have made, the list is dizzying to contemplate. She could have been one of the great actresses of the 20th century. She could have become Katharine Hepburn, or Bette Davis, or Meryl Streep. Instead, she became a princess. She met Prince Rainier III of Monaco at the Cannes Film Festival in May 1955. The meeting was arranged, as these things often were, through a combination of public relations calculation and aristocratic curiosity. Monaco needed good press. Grace Kelly was the most famous actress in the world. A photograph of them together would be valuable. Their handlers made the introduction. What happened next was not entirely scripted. Rainier was 31 years old, the sovereign of a tiny principality on the French Riviera. 2.02 square kilometers of land, roughly the size of a large city park, wedged between France and the Mediterranean. He was attractive in an old-world way, with dark eyes and the kind of bearing that comes from being taught from birth that you are different from other people. He was also lonely in the particular way that power makes people lonely, surrounded constantly by those who need something from him, never quite sure whether anyone wanted simply to be with him. Grace was 25, at the peak of her fame, and quietly exhausted by it. Hollywood was beginning to feel like a gilded cage. The constant scrutiny, the roles that were always variations on the same beautiful enigma, the sense that her real self was disappearing behind the image, it was wearing on her. They spoke through an interpreter for their first meeting, in the gardens of the palace. Rainier showed her his private zoo. She seemed genuinely delighted by the tigers. He noticed. The courtship that followed was largely conducted by letter, across the Atlantic. Rainier was strategic about it. He needed an heir, and he needed a wife who would bring Monaco the international attention it needed to survive economically. Grace was ideal on paper. But the letters, by all accounts, became something more than strategic. He was funny, in his letters. He was vulnerable, in a way that public figures rarely permit themselves to be. Grace responded to this. She always responded to the things that people tried to hide. They announced their engagement in January 1956. The reaction was everything it was supposed to be, front pages across the world, the fairy tale narrative that the 20th century hadn't even known it needed until it appeared. The Hollywood princess becomes a real one. Her father Jack Kelly was reportedly not entirely enthusiastic. He wrote to Rainier asking that if the marriage was unhappy, Grace be permitted to return home. It was an unusual request, and it revealed something. The Kelly family's hard-won pragmatism, the suspicion beneath the celebration, the knowledge that fairy tales are stories told about events whose endings are not yet known. The wedding took place on April 19, 1956, in the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate in Monaco. Grace's dress, designed by MGM's Helen Rose, was made of 25 yards of silk taffeta, antique rose point lace, and pearl beading. It took 6 weeks and 36 seamstresses to make. It has been described, ever since, as one of the most beautiful wedding dresses in history. The cameras loved it. The cameras loved all of it. And then, slowly, quietly, without announcement or ceremony, the cameras stopped. Because Princess Grace of Monaco was not permitted to make films. Rainier had decided this before the wedding. A princess appearing on the commercial stage was undignified, he felt. It was not appropriate to the role. Grace had known this was a condition of the marriage. She had accepted it. But accepting something in theory and living with it in practice are different things. The first years were not unhappy, exactly. There was the novelty of a new country, a new language, a new identity. There were state dinners and charitable functions and the intricate social choreography of European aristocracy. There were pregnancies. Caroline was born in 1957, Albert in 1958, Stephanie in 1965. Grace threw herself into motherhood and into the public duties of her position with the same discipline she had brought to everything else in her life. She was, by all accounts, an excellent princess. She was organized, articulate, capable, and genuinely committed to Monaco's cultural development. She established the Princess Grace Foundation, which supported the arts across Europe and America. She promoted ballet, design, theatre. She created the Bouquet de Monaco, a flower arrangement competition that became internationally renowned. She was doing real work, meaningful work, but it was not her work. The films kept not happening. Hitchcock offered her the lead in Marnie in 1963, a complex, dark psychological thriller that would have been, arguably, the greatest role of her career. Grace wanted to do it. Rainier eventually said no, under pressure from the Monegasque public, who felt that their princess appearing in a Hollywood film was demeaning. The role went to Tippi Hedren instead. This was the wound that never quite healed. The people who knew Grace in the 1960s and 1970s describe a gradual shift that is painful to trace. The discipline remained. The composure remained. But something else changed, a quality of aliveness, of engagement, that her closest friends say they could see draining away over the years. The way a battery loses charge so slowly you don't notice until one day it simply stops. She began to drink more. Not obviously, not publicly. Grace was too controlled for that, but enough that her inner circle noticed. She suffered from anxiety. She had periods of depression that she managed, as she managed everything, with tremendous private effort and no public acknowledgement. Her marriage to Rainier was not cruel, exactly, but it was formal in the way that royal marriages tend to be formal. Two people performing their roles beside each other, sharing a life in the logistical sense without necessarily sharing it in any deeper one. She told a friend once, "I don't have anyone to talk to." She said this not in bitterness, but in simple bewilderment, as if she had looked up one day and discovered, with genuine surprise, that despite being one of the most famous women in the world, she was profoundly alone. And into this loneliness, eventually, came Stephanie. Of her 3 children, Stephanie was the one who was most like Grace. Not on the surface. On the surface, Stephanie was everything Grace had been taught not to be. Impulsive, openly emotional, disrespectful of convention, in love with noise and speed and freedom. She raced motorcycles. She wore clothes that scandalized the Monegasque establishment. She made decisions that made the palace communications team desperate. But underneath the performance of rebellion was the same hunger that had driven Grace to New York at 18 with a suitcase and a conviction that she was meant for something larger than her family had imagined. The same need to be seen as a self, not as a symbol. The same refusal, ultimately, to accept a diminished version of the life she wanted. Grace recognized this. Of course she did. It was her own face in a mirror that had been set at a different angle. But recognition does not automatically produce acceptance, and in Stephanie's case, Grace's recognition of her own younger self seemed to produce, paradoxically, more conflict rather than less. Every choice Stephanie made that reminded Grace of her own suppressed desires also reminded her of what she had given up. Every argument about Stephanie's future was also, on some level, an argument about Grace's past. By the summer of 1982, The tension had reached a breaking point. Stephanie wanted to leave Monaco and pursue a career in the music industry. Grace felt this was a mistake, professionally, personally, and in terms of what it meant for the family's public standing. Their arguments were long and exhausting and circular. Neither was wrong. Neither could see the other's position with any clarity. On the evening of September 13, 1982, the night before the accident, they had another argument. It ended without resolution, as all the others had. On a clear September morning in 1982, Grace Kelly began a drive she had taken hundreds of times before. The road from Rockagel to Monte Carlo winds through the hills above Monaco, narrow and twisting, carved into pale limestone cliffs. From certain turns, the Mediterranean flashes between the pine trees, and the tiny principality of Monaco spreads out below like a glittering toy city. Grace knew every bend of that road. For more than 26 years, it had been part of the rhythm of her life. That morning, her youngest daughter, Princess Stephanie, sat beside her in the passenger seat. They were talking as they drove down the mountain, talking about the future, about plans, about the tension that had been growing between them for months. It was not an easy conversation. At some point during the descent, Grace mentioned she had a headache. In the previous weeks, she had been feeling unusually tired. She had occasionally experienced dizziness and fatigue, and had mentioned it briefly to her doctor. But Grace Kelly had always been reluctant to treat small physical symptoms as something serious. She continued driving. The car approached one of the final bends in the road, a left-hand curve protected by a low guardrail. What happened next took only seconds. The Rover 3500 did not slow down. Instead of turning with the road, it continued straight. The car broke through the guardrail and suddenly became airborne. Beyond the road, the hillside dropped sharply into a garden nearly 40 meters below. Stephanie realized what was happening and instinctively braced herself. Grace, investigators later believed, may already have lost consciousness. The car crashed into the garden below, rolling violently as it landed. When everything stopped moving, Stephanie was alive. Shocked and injured, but conscious. Grace was found inside the car, alive but unconscious. An ambulance rushed her to Princess Grace Hospital, the hospital built under her own patronage. Doctors worked throughout the day trying to save her life. Later medical investigations revealed what had happened. During the drive, Grace had suffered a small ischemic stroke, a sudden blockage of blood flow in part of her brain. It had likely occurred moments before the car reached the curve. The stroke caused her to lose control. The accident had not been caused by recklessness or distraction. Something had simply failed inside her body without warning. The impact of the crash caused severe brain injuries and 2 hemorrhages. Grace never regained consciousness. At 10 p.m. on September 14, 1982, Princess Grace of Monaco was declared dead. She was 52 years old. The news was announced the following morning. Around the world, people struggled to absorb it. Grace Kelly had existed for decades as something almost timeless, a symbol of elegance, beauty, and the modern fairy tale. Fairy tales are not supposed to end like this. Her friends in Hollywood were devastated. Cary Grant, who had starred beside her in To Catch a Thief, reportedly could not speak about her death. They had remained close friends for nearly 30 years. Frank Sinatra, another longtime friend, refused interviews. For many in the film world, her death felt like the closing of an era. In Monaco, the mourning was real and profound. Thousands of people lined the streets during her funeral procession. Flags in the harbor flew at half-mast. Even the famous Monte Carlo casino closed its doors. Prince Rainier, her husband, was quietly broken by the loss. Years earlier he had asked her to leave Hollywood behind and become the Princess of Monaco. She had agreed, sacrificing a career that had only begun to reach its peak. After her death, Rainier never remarried. He lived another 23 years, and when he died in 2005 he was buried beside her in the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate, the same cathedral where they had married in 1956 before millions of television viewers. For Princess Stephanie, the memory of that morning never disappeared. She had been 18 years old in the passenger seat. She survived the accident with only minor injuries, but the emotional weight of it followed her throughout her life. In the years that followed, she pursued a music career, released pop songs, raised children, and slowly built a quieter life away from constant public attention. She rarely speaks about the accident. When she does, she remembers small details. The light of the morning, the road through the hills, her mother's hands on the steering wheel, and the moment just before everything changed. She was there. But even after decades, she has never been able to fully describe her mother's final moment. Some memories are simply too close to see clearly. Behind the myth and the fairy tale, Grace Kelly's life had always been more complicated than the public image suggested. She was the daughter of a fiercely competitive father who expected success in everything. She became an actress known for precision and discipline, determined to prove she was more than simply a beautiful face. Then she fell in love and became Princess of Monaco. But the role required sacrifice. Prince Rainier asked her to stop acting. And she did. The woman who had commanded movie screens around the world redirected that same energy into raising her children, representing a country, and performing the endless duties of royal life. She did it with remarkable commitment. But those who knew her best often said there was also loneliness in that life, a loneliness that fame and beauty and wealth could never fully erase. She died at 52, an age when many people are just beginning a new chapter. In the early 1980s, there had even been quiet discussions about a possible return to the stage, perhaps a one-woman performance, poetry readings, something small and intimate. A chance for Grace Kelly to simply be Grace Kelly again. But that moment never came. Instead, there was a road in the hills above Monaco. A familiar drive on a clear September morning. A daughter beside her. A life still full of unfinished conversations and unrealized possibilities. Then, in a single instant, something inside her brain failed. A tiny blood vessel blocked. The road turned left. The car continued straight. That is the simple mechanical truth of what happened. A woman. A road. A moment of biological failure that could happen to anyone. But it happened to Grace Kelly. And because it happened to her, the world paused. People remembered the elegance, the beauty, the mysterious life lived between Hollywood and royalty. She had given everything she had to a role she never originally planned to play. And she performed it with a grace deeper than the one audiences saw on screen. On that September morning, with the Mediterranean shining below and her daughter beside her, her story ended. Not with music. Not with applause. Just a road, a curve, and silence. Some stories do not end. They simply stop. Grace Kelly's stopped on September 14, 1982, somewhere on a winding road above Monaco. Everything else, the films, the fairy tale, the legend, is the story we continue telling afterward. And perhaps we always will.